Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. Beneath the beauty of the Silver Bend Mountains lies a deadly secret, unstable soil, ignored warnings, and a luxury dream built on disaster. When nature speaks through mud and ruin, one man's truth becomes the last defense against a collapse no one wanted to believe. I always thought there was a certain poetry in dirt. Not the soft garden variety stuff you buy in plastic bags outside Home Depot, but real earth, layers of history compressed into something that demanded respect. Maybe that's why I became a geotechnical engineer in the first place. Maybe that's why my parents' old 17-acre property at the base of the Silver Bend Mountains always felt less like land and more like a living creature I'd grown up alongside. When they passed and the deed officially became mine, it didn't feel like an inheritance. It felt like someone handing me the care of an old friend with a temper problem. The temper, of course, was the slope. The whole area had been mapped as high-risk terrain for as long as I could remember, and for good reason. The ground here wasn't like the compact, obedient soils near town. These slopes were made of moisture-sensitive clay and sandy debris that could lose strength the moment they felt disrespected. I knew this intimately because I had been one of the engineers who helped categorize the zone over a decade ago. My name was on the supporting documents, the risk tables, the hazard assessments. Hell, there were even a couple of maps where you could still see my handwriting because the scanner back then didn't pick up pencil marks properly. So when I decided to sell 9 acres of it, I wasn't doing it casually. I documented every weakness, every historical microslide, every drainage line. I wrote warnings so explicit that even a half-awake intern could understand them. Not recommended for dense development, limited load residential structures only. I lowered the price to reflect the constraints. I didn't hide anything because in my line of work, people die when someone gets lazy. I wasn't expecting a sprawling subdivision of tiny palaces or anything, maybe a couple of cabins, a retreat home or two. And, for a while, the potential buyers seemed reasonable. Small developers, families with savings, off-grid enthusiasts looking for a quiet corner to retire in. Then a new name entered the conversation. Summit Crest Homeowners Association, represented by a woman who introduced herself with the same energy a CEO uses to announce a hostile takeover. Her name was Karen Manders, early 50s, impeccable hair, smile sharp enough to slice through drywall. She talked fast, walked faster, and seemed allergic to the concept of slowing down long enough to listen. She kept referring to their vision, an eco-friendly luxury community that would harmonize with the mountain's natural silhouette. She talked about geothermal systems, solar grids, sustainable architecture, and elevated mountain living for the elite buyer. She didn't mention geology once, which was impressive considering we were standing on a slope that could, under the right circumstances, liquefy like cheap pudding. During our final meeting before signing, I brought out a stack of my old USGS reports, including the 19-page hazard summary I'd written 15 years earlier. I laid everything out on the hood of my truck, like evidence in a courtroom. Karen skimmed the pages the way a tourist skims a restaurant menu in a foreign language, smiling, nodding, clearly understanding nothing. I pointed at the slope rating. I pointed at the drainage map. I pointed at the historical slide zones outlined in angry red. I even told her about the time when, as a kid, I watched a section of the hillside slump 3 feet down slope after a week of monsoon rains. She glanced at me over the top of the papers and said, "We're not looking for pessimism, Mr. Wells. We have architects. Very good ones." I hadn't been called a pessimist since college. Usually people called me a realist, or on grumpy days, the guy who ruins optimistic timelines. Pessimist was new. I tried again. "Karen, this isn't about pessimism. This is about soil structure. You can build here, but not densely. 3 or 4 small homes, max. Anything more than that, and the slope won't handle it." She laughed. Not a big laugh. More like a light exhale with ego attached. "Our engineers think otherwise. Your engineers haven't worked on this mountain. We trust their expertise." Of course they did. People like Karen trusted expertise only when it confirmed what they'd already decided. I felt the conversation slipping away, but the paperwork was clean on my end, and everything I needed to disclose was documented in writing. She signed every form, acknowledging the risks. She initialed beside the paragraph that explained slope instability. She even wrote her signature next to the clause that explicitly recommended against high-density construction. I watched her pen carve those loops and lines with the kind of confidence usually reserved for surgeons. When the deal closed, I should have felt relief. Instead, I got that old uneasy twinge in my stomach, the same one I got before unstable soil started to move. But I told myself I'd done everything right, everything honest, everything by the book. The land was no longer mine, and I had warned them thoroughly. Whatever they built was their responsibility now. At the time, I had no idea how quickly that responsibility would boomerang back toward me. I didn't have to wait long to see the first signs that something was very, very wrong. About 2 months after the sale, I took my truck up the public access road that skirted the edge of my remaining acreage. I wasn't trying to snoop. It was just the usual supply run to town. But as I drove past the ridge, I heard a low rumble that sounded suspiciously like an excavator bucket grinding against rock. At first, I thought maybe Summit Crest was installing utilities or carving out a couple of pads for those 3 or 4 small homes I'd mentioned. I was wrong on a scale that should have been mathematically impossible. As I rounded the bend, the entire slope seemed to have exploded into a construction zone. Trucks, bulldozers, graders, cement mixers, more heavy machinery than I'd ever seen on this mountain in my life, were crawling all over the hillside like oversized metal insects. They weren't shaping a few building lots. They were reshaping the mountain itself. Huge sections of topsoil had been shaved down. Natural drainage paths were filled in with compacted aggregate. Entire shelves were being carved out in straight, unnatural terraces that made my skin crawl. And there was asphalt. Actual asphalt. I watched in disbelief as a crew laid down a broad, curving road that cut across the slope like someone had decided to tattoo a scar on the mountain. No drainage trenches, no retaining walls. No reinforced subgrade, just a pretty black ribbon that would look fantastic on a real estate brochure, right up until gravity decided to have its way with it. I pulled my truck to the side of the road and just stared. 23 houses. That's what the layout markers and construction signs spelled out. 23. I could barely get my jaw to close. The geotechnical limitations weren't suggestions. They weren't maybe warnings. They were physical laws. And these people were building a miniature city on a geological booby trap. I took my drone out of the glove box, launched it, and did a full high-resolution sweep of the site. What I saw made my chest tighten. Not only were they ignoring the natural drainage lines, they were actively blocking them. The original water channels, the ones that kept the slope from turning into a mudslide during heavy rains, had been paved over or redirected into shallow trenches that wouldn't survive the first decent storm. In one area, workers were using loose fill dirt where they should have been laying engineered backfill. It was the kind of shortcut that got people killed. I zoomed in on one of the larger cuts they'd made into the hillside. Exposed soil layers told the whole story. Layers of clay alternating with pockets of sandy silt, exactly the kind of stratified geology that collapses when water pressure builds up. And instead of mitigating that risk, they were pouring concrete footings right on top of unstable substrate. No pile foundations, no soil nailing, just blind faith and a budget. I drove straight to the makeshift construction office, a large white trailer with Summit Crest banners stapled to the side, and walked in without knocking. A young guy in a reflective vest looked up from a clipboard, startled. I asked for Karen. He told me she wasn't on site. I left a message for her. Stop construction and call me immediately. Then I left a printed copy of my hazard report on the counter just to make sure they couldn't claim ignorance later. By evening, I still hadn't heard from her, so I drafted a formal notice of concern addressed to the Summit Crest HOA board and emailed it to every contact listed in their development filing. I even added a polite but firm reminder that ignoring documented geotechnical hazards could open them up to massive liability. I attached every relevant map, every risk assessment, every cautionary note. And because I'm not the kind of man who likes leaving things to chance, I mailed a hard copy via certified mail. 2 days later, rather than receiving a reasonable response from Karen or their engineering team, I got something else entirely. A letter from an attorney representing the HOA. According to them, my unsolicited interference in their development constituted harassment and defamation. They warned me to cease any further attempts to undermine the project and threatened to pursue legal action if I continued to spread false information about the structural integrity of their construction. False information. about a slope I had personally mapped for the federal government, about risks I'd disclosed in writing, about geological behavior that didn't give one single damn about real estate marketing. I scheduled a meeting with the municipal planning office instead, figuring surely someone there would listen. They didn't. The clerk acknowledged receiving my concerns, but told me, with a bored expression, that the permits had been approved by Summit Crest's own licensed engineer. When I asked for the engineer's credentials, the clerk flipped through a few pages, frowned, and said, "They're on file." Then he handed me a pamphlet about respecting the development process. I walked out of that office, fighting the urge to break the pamphlet in half. That night, a local newspaper published an opinion column written by none other than Karen Manders. It was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive public relations. She accused a certain former landowner of trying to sabotage their sustainable mountain community out of bitterness and jealousy. She implied that my warnings were pseudoscience, that my concerns were rooted in spite, and that Summit Crest was a shining example of modern eco-conscious development. I closed my laptop and let the silence settle. They weren't just ignoring me. They were erasing the truth. And they were doing it with confidence born from the belief that people wouldn't question them, that the paperwork was theirs, that the permits were theirs, that the mountain would obediently bend to their will. But mountains don't bend. They wait. The first sign that the mountain was waking up came in the form of a hairline crack. Not one of the dramatic movie-style ones that split open with a thunderclap, but a thin, almost polite fracture along the brand-new asphalt Summit Crest had laid. I noticed it early one morning while hiking my property line, coffee mug in hand, trying very hard to mind my own business. The crack ran diagonally, like the pavement was frowning in confusion. I squatted down, touched it with my fingers, and felt that faint, familiar shift beneath the surface. Subtle, but undeniable. When ground settles on stable soil, it feels inert. When ground settles on an unstable slope, there's a kind of tension to it, like stepping on a taut wire. A week later, that single crack had cousins. A cluster of them snaked across the road near one of the house pads, spider-webbing outward. At the same time, 2 light posts installed by the HOA had begun to tilt, just a few degrees, but enough for someone with my background to know the soil was starting to creep down slope. Slow movements like this were nature's version of clearing its throat before yelling. I decided it was time to talk directly to the residents, not through letters or legal channels that Summit Crest controlled. One evening, as people were returning home from work, teachers, nurses, retirees eager to settle into their newly built mountaintop paradises, I positioned myself near the entrance of the development, right outside their property line to avoid giving Karen ammunition. I wasn't holding protest signs or shouting warnings like a doomsday prophet. I simply talked to whoever approached. Most people were polite. A few recognized me as the guy Karen wrote about and kept walking. Others lingered, curious. I showed them the same USGS slope map I'd given Summit Crest. I pointed out where natural drainage lines used to be before the bulldozers erased them. I explained, calmly and professionally, that certain soil compositions, when overloaded and moisture-saturated, behave more like pudding than rock. I kept it factual, scientific, clear. Some listened, some asked questions. One man even told me he had noticed his deck post shifting slightly, but hadn't wanted to mention it because Summit Crest had told them the ground just needed to settle. Another woman described faint popping sounds under her driveway at night. These weren't strangers to common sense. They were homeowners who trusted the people who sold them the dream. But trust is a fragile thing, and Summit Crest wasted no time trying to smash whatever I'd built that evening. The next morning, my mailbox was stuffed with a cease and desist letter accusing me of spreading fear-mongering misinformation and harassing residents. Even better, someone from the HOA plastered laminated notices around the community entrance with a photo of me taken from God knows where and a caption that read, "Do not engage with this individual. He is actively attempting to undermine our community and devalue your property." I laughed when I saw it. Not a joyful laugh, but the kind that comes from watching an already burning dumpster roll downhill into a fireworks factory. And then things escalated. One afternoon, I received an unmarked envelope slipped under my front door. No return address, no message. just a single printed document inside, a heavily edited internal engineering assessment from Summit Crest that plainly stated the slope was unstable and recommended immediate installation of retaining structures and deep drainage. All identifying names and credentials had been clumsily covered with white correction fluid, but the date was visible, and the header clearly showed it came from the HOA's engineering review. I stared at it for several minutes, my mind alternating between vindication and concern. Someone on the inside wanted me to know the truth, or wanted the truth out badly enough to risk their job. That was the moment I knew the situation had moved from dangerously incompetent to actively hiding evidence. I didn't wait. I scanned the document, added it to a public post online, and attached drone footage showing the ongoing construction mistakes, trench backfill inconsistencies, improper compaction, the blocked natural water channels, and the unmistakable tilt-in. Several sections of newly installed fencing. The post spread quickly. Local hikers commented that they'd noticed the new trail detours Summit Crest installed were already slumping. Former city engineer chimed in, recognizing the soil profile from his own work years ago. Naturally, Karen exploded. Before the day was over, she had posted a furious, caps-laced response online accusing me of fabricating evidence, harassing her community, and illegally operating a drone. Because, of course, she tried that angle. She even claimed my obsession with the development was rooted in regret for selling prime land at a loss. The funniest part, I hadn't lost anything on the sale. The price had been discounted for danger, and that was public record. But people like Karen never let facts get in the way of a good tantrum. As winter approached, my sensors began telling the rest of the story for me. The moisture content in the clay layers jumped significantly after the first set of seasonal rains. My slope deformation monitors, old equipment I'd set up on my own land out of habit, started logging incremental but consistent movement at the southern edge of the development. Anyone who knew soil would have understood it immediately. The slope was shifting, slowly, then faster, like someone pushing a heavy object on a table and finally overcoming the friction. I felt that cold weight in my stomach again, the one I'd felt when Karen ignored my warnings, the one I'd felt seeing the excavators on the slope, the one that always came before the ground did something unforgiving. The mountain wasn't just clearing its throat anymore, it was inhaling. The night the mountain finally snapped was one of those desert storms that doesn't announce itself politely. There was no gentle buildup, no distant rumble giving people time to close their windows or bring in their patio furniture. It hit like a fist, lightning cracking across the sky, rain slamming the ground so hard it sounded like handfuls of gravel hurled by an angry god. I'd seen storms like this before growing up here, but even as a kid I'd never felt the land tremble underneath it the way it did that night. I wasn't asleep. I'd been pacing my kitchen for about an hour, checking my slope sensors every few minutes. The readings were ugly, steady displacement through the day, followed by a sudden spike once the rain started. Clay doesn't like water. It drinks it, swells, loses cohesion, and starts sliding over itself like wet sheets of paper. I refreshed the readout again. Another few millimeters of shift, not catastrophic by itself, but shifts like this aren't solo events. They travel. By 2 o'clock, the storm was hammering the mountainside so hard it felt like the whole ridge was vibrating. I pulled on my jacket, grabbed my drone case, and stepped out onto my porch. The air was thick with mist and the smell of wet earth. That smell that means the ground is changing shape somewhere you can't see yet. The sky flashed bright white, and for a moment I saw the outline of the Summit Crest homes up the slope. Still lit, still looking like a postcard dream bought at luxury prices. That dream lasted about 20 more minutes. At 2:37, the first alarm on my phone screamed. One of my ground tilt sensors had tripped into emergency range. I froze, staring at the numbers as they jumped again. Not a slow creep. A jolt. Something had given way. I didn't have time to think. I grabbed my keys, sprinted to my truck, and tore up the access road, tires slipping on the muddy surface. Halfway up the ridge, the earth made a sound I'll never forget. A deep, resonant groan like the mountain itself was exhaling after holding its breath too long. Then came the crunch, the shattering, the kind of noise that makes your instincts crawl up your spine even if you don't understand geology. When I reached the overlook point, the world was chaos. A section of the development, 5 houses, a stretch of brand new asphalt, and part of the so-called scenic plaza was simply gone. Not tilted, not broken, gone. The ground had liquefied beneath it and poured downhill like a slow-motion river of mud, taking entire structures with it. I watched a 2-story home, lights still on, tilt forward, slide, and disappear over the edge of a newly formed drop. Debris followed it. A kid's swing set, sections of fencing, roof shingles carried like paper scraps in the flood of soil and rock. For a second, I forgot to breathe. Then I remembered there were people in those houses. I dialed 911 with shaking hands. The dispatcher barely finished saying hello before I blurted out the location, the number of structures, the fact that the slope was still moving. While on the line, I launched my drone, sending it into the storm, its small body buffeted by wind hard enough to bend the propellers. The live feed was shaky but usable. I relayed what I saw. Tilted foundations, half-collapsed roofs, one house wedged against a cluster of pine trees halfway down the ravine. In another, I saw movement, someone trapped inside, waving a flashlight. Emergency crews arrived faster than I expected, sirens wailing through the rain. Firefighters, rescue units, sheriff's deputies, they poured onto the scene, coordinating with the drone footage I was transmitting. I watched them deploy ropes and harnesses, slipping and cursing in the mud, pulling dazed residents out through broken windows. One woman was screaming for her dog. A man staggered past me barefoot, covered in mud up to his shoulders, holding a bloody towel to his head. He kept saying, "The ground opened. The ground opened." Through all of this, Karen appeared like she'd been summoned by the sirens. Hair soaked, mascara streaming, expression locked somewhere between rage and panic. She stormed up to me as if I were the one who had personally pushed her development off the mountain. "This is your fault," she shrieked, loud enough that one of the paramedics turned his head. "You knew this land was unstable. You didn't tell us. You sold us defective property." I stared at her, drenched, exhausted, adrenaline still pounding in my ears. "Karen, I told you. I warned you. You signed documents saying you understood." "Lies!" she screamed. "You didn't warn us about this. You sabotaged our project. You've been attacking us from the start because you regretted selling the land." I should have expected it, but watching her twist reality in front of people who were literally being pulled out of broken homes was something else. Reporters had arrived by then, local and regional, and I saw 2 cameras swivel toward us. Great! National humiliation incoming. Karen jabbed a finger into my chest. "You caused this. You will pay for this. Summit Crest will not let you destroy us." I held her wrist mid-jab and moved her hand aside. "People could have died tonight, Karen. This isn't a PR disaster. This is a geological failure caused by your construction choices. Don't make this about me." But she was already turning to the nearest reporter, shouting, "He hid geological hazards. He lied on the disclosures. He knew this would happen." I stepped back, disgusted, as she spun her narrative. The cameras loved it. A screaming HOA president, a destroyed luxury community, a stormy mountainside. It was made for dramatic headlines. Within minutes, Karen was giving an emotional, rambling statement about betrayal and negligence. I caught one of the deputies giving me a sympathetic look as if to say, "Sorry, man, you're the villain tonight, whether you like it or not." And then the cherry on top arrived just after dawn. Summit Crest HOA filed an emergency civil claim against me for $10 million, accusing me of withholding critical geological information and selling them dangerously defective land. $10 million! For a slope that had been unstable long before I ever learned to walk. As rescue crews continued their work, as bulldozers dug out buried cars, as trembling families were escorted to temporary shelters, Karen stood there giving victory speeches to reporters, insisting that justice would be served. Meanwhile, the mountain, having made its point, finally fell silent. By sunrise, the chaos had settled into something colder: blame. Rescue crews were still combing through debris when my phone buzzed nonstop with messages from journalists wanting quotes, residents demanding explanations, and a lawyer representing Summit Crest threatening immediate legal action if I continued. Obstructing the truth. The truth, apparently, was whatever Karen shouted loudest into the nearest microphone. I'd barely slept an hour, running on stale coffee and the uncomfortable knowledge that I was now public enemy number 1 in a disaster I'd predicted with painful precision. I knew better than to try fighting this in comment sections or news clips. HOA propaganda spreads faster than a mudslide, and the only antidote is documented fact. So I set up a small folding table in front of my house, placed my old laptop on it, and pulled up every geological record I'd accumulated over the last 2 decades. I wasn't angry. I was determined. If they wanted a war, they were going to get one, but it would be fought in daylight, with evidence. By midday, reporters began trickling up my driveway. One asked if I felt responsible for the collapse. I answered by showing them the signed hazard acknowledgement Karen had initialed on page 6 of our sale contract. Another asked whether I'd hidden crucial soil data. I flipped open a manila folder and pulled out the original USGS slope assessment, my handwriting still visible in faded pencil. Someone else questioned whether I'd exaggerated the risks to inflate my expertise in hindsight. I pointed at the 15-year-old map with the exact same hazard zone that had just failed. They came looking for controversy. They left with documents. But I wasn't done. After the early interviews, I opened my drone archive and pulled footage from the entire construction period. I edited nothing. No dramatic music. No commentary. Just timestamps, coordinates, and raw imagery. Workers pouring concrete directly onto uncompacted fill, excavators digging too wide into the hillside, trenches backfilled with loose dirt, water runoff visibly pooling in places it never should have been. I uploaded it all, several hours worth, to an online repository, made the files public, and sent the link to every local and regional news outlet. The shift in tone was almost instantaneous. Reporters returned, now asking why Summit Crest ignored basic engineering standards. Social media posts emerged from construction workers anonymously admitting they'd been rushed to meet deadlines. A former HOA volunteer commented that Karen had bragged about cutting wasteful safety expenses, a phrase that aged worse than raw chicken left in a hot car. Then came the real bombshell. 2 engineers I'd spoken to months before, the ones Summit Crest had fired for refusing to sign an optimistic interpretation of the slope data, finally returned my calls. Maybe the collapse shook something loose in their conscience, or maybe they just got tired of watching Karen rewrite history. Either way, we met in a diner off Highway 7 where the waitress knew me by name and poured my coffee without asking. They brought evidence, internal emails showing they warned the HOA about slope instability, draft reports recommending retaining walls, a deleted section of an early analysis highlighting the need for deeper foundations, and the smoking gun, a directive from Karen herself instructing them to streamline the report because investors don't like obstacles. I scanned every page, logged every metadata timestamp, and stored multiple backups. Then I asked the question I'd been circling for weeks. Who signed the final geotechnical approval? They exchanged uneasy looks before one admitted, "We never signed it. Someone forged our names after we walked." That was when my pulse stopped feeling like a hammer and started feeling like clarity. A forgery wasn't negligence, it was a felony. And if the HOA had forged engineering signatures to secure permits, suddenly their $10 million lawsuit against me held less water than the slope they'd just melted. I sent everything to the county attorney, the state geological office, and FEMA. Within hours, I received confirmation that multiple investigations had been opened. The storm may have triggered the collapse, but the paperwork was about to trigger something much bigger. While I was gathering evidence, Karen continued her PR crusade, giving teary-eyed statements about betrayal and deceit. But cracks were forming in her story just as quickly as they'd formed in her precious asphalt. Homeowners began asking why she'd dismissed my warnings. Journalists began asking why the HOA's engineers refused to speak on camera. And then a new headline hit the evening news. Internal documents suggest Summit Crest ignored slope safety requirements. I didn't celebrate. Not yet. But for the first time since the earth gave way, I felt the balance shift. The narrative was changing, not because I yelled louder, but because the truth was finally echoing back. Investigators don't usually arrive in unison, but that week, my driveway looked like a parking lot for every regulatory agency within a 100-mile radius. County engineers showed up first, armed with clipboards and laser levels, followed by state geologists unloading core sampling equipment. By mid-afternoon, 2 FEMA officials and windbreakers were walking the perimeter of the collapse zone with satellite tablets, muttering in that grim bureaucratic tone that says things are about to get expensive for someone. I watched from a distance, not intruding, but not exactly uninvolved. The land used to be mine, and half the data they were using originated from reports I'd written in my 20s. At one point, a FEMA assessor recognized my name on an old hazard map and approached me with cautious respect, like someone meeting a retired firefighter at the scene of a blaze he'd warned about years earlier. He asked a few questions about the soil layers, the typical moisture retention after seasonal storms, historical slide patterns. I answered directly, professionally, without embellishment. The man nodded slowly as I spoke, the kind of nod that meant, yes, this fits exactly with what we are seeing. Meanwhile, Karen was doing everything in her power to project authority. She hovered near investigators like an overeager tour guide, insisting the collapse was an unforeseeable act of nature and not, as she put it, a consequence of malicious fear-mongering from certain disgruntled parties. She tried to keep them away from certain areas, specifically the blocked drainage lines, but officials brushed her off with the type of courtesy reserved for someone they already suspected of lying. Then came the discovery that changed everything. One of the state geologists flagged down a colleague, pointing at a strange discoloration in the exposed soil near where the first house had gone under. They dug carefully, testing the density, the layering, the integrity. Within minutes, whispers spread through the team. I approached slowly, staying behind the marked tape until one of the lead engineers acknowledged me and motioned me closer. The subsurface backfill beneath the road wasn't engineered material. It was random loose fill, cheap, unstable, and wholly inappropriate for a slope with a high-risk classification. Worse, the compaction data that Summit Crest had submitted for their permit approvals claimed the backfill met state standards. The state engineer holding the sample shook his head. This isn't even close. They faked the compaction values. That alone was bad enough, but it was just the appetizer. A FEMA official cross-referenced the paperwork the HOA submitted with their internal database and found a red flag notice that Summit Crest had received 3 weeks before the collapse. The notice specifically stated the development sat on a hazard zone requiring construction suspension during heavy rain cycles. The HOA not only ignored the freeze order, they accelerated their building schedule. When Karen heard investigators discussing the notice, she stormed toward them like a woman possessed. "That document wasn't final," she shrieked. "It was a suggestion, not a mandate. It was a federal directive," the FEMA agent corrected. "And ignoring it constitutes criminal negligence." The look on her face when she realized those words were not negotiable was almost worth the disaster behind us. The next blow came from the county attorney's office. The engineers I'd spoken to earlier had sent in sworn statements confirming their signatures were forged on Summit Crest's final geotechnical report. Investigators recovered the original draft, the one recommending retaining structures and deep foundations, from a deleted email archive Karen had apparently tried to wipe. Digital forensics recovered everything. Her instructions to streamline the report, her refusal to approve safety expenditures, even a message complaining that all this geology nonsense is slowing down our launch timeline. The mountain collapsing wasn't the only landslide happening that week. Residents who'd lost their homes began giving their own testimonies. One man recounted noticing cracks months earlier and being told by the HOA that he'd be fined if he kept spreading destabilizing rumors. Another woman described a mandatory meeting where Karen told them that fear is bad for community morale and any concerns about soil movement should be reported privately to her office, where naturally she did nothing with them. And unless the universe wanted to add comedic timing to a tragedy, the local news station aired leaked footage from a construction worker's phone. In the video, Karen stood on site during a light rainstorm shouting at crews to keep pouring concrete despite the mud forming under their boots. "Investors are coming next week," she yelled. "We don't have time for delays." The footage spread quickly. Karen tried claiming it was taken out of context. The internet disagreed. By the end of the week, the prosecutor's office announced a formal investigation into Summit Crest HOA and its leadership for negligence, fraud, falsification of engineering documentation, obstruction of a federal safety order, and reckless endangerment. When deputies arrived at the HOA office trailer with a warrant, Karen attempted to stop them at the door, shouting that they were violating her rights. They walked past her like she was a mildly noisy breeze. One investigator paused to ask whether I'd be willing to provide expert testimony if needed. I answered yes without hesitation. I hadn't gone looking for a fight, but if the mountain was finally being heard, I wasn't about to go quiet. The courthouse felt unnervingly calm the morning the trial began, the kind of calm that makes you think the building itself is holding its breath. I took my seat near the front, not as a defendant anymore, but as a witness, though judging by the glares from Summit Crest supporters, I might as well have been the one on trial. Karen sat at the defense table in a blazer 2 sizes too confident, hair styled like she was attending a real estate gala rather than facing a list of charges longer than some criminal rap sheets I'd seen. Her lawyers opened with theatrics, painting her as a visionary betrayed by a disgruntled former landowner with a vendetta. They called the collapse an unforeseeable natural disaster, insisting no reasonable person could have predicted it. I almost laughed. Predicting it had been as easy as observing rainfall and gravity. When the prosecutor began presenting evidence, the room changed. They displayed the signed hazard disclosures, the exact ones Karen had claimed never existed. They showed the forged engineering signatures, the emails she'd tried to delete, the FEMA freeze order she'd ignored. They even played the phone footage of her demanding that workers pour concrete in the rain. Karen kept shaking her head, mouthing, "That's fake," as if denying reality might bend it back into shape. Then came my turn. I walked to the witness stand and swore in. The prosecutor guided me through the geology, the clay layers, the drainage lines, the slope's history, and the parts of the USGS report I'd personally authored. The jury listened intently. Even Karen's attorneys stopped scribbling. I explained how the blocked drainage had increased pore water pressure, how the loose fill under the asphalt acted like ball bearings once saturated, how the slope movement readings had spiked hours before the collapse. The defense tried to rattle me, claiming my data was outdated, that I was biased, that I held resentment over selling the land. I countered with documents, timestamps, drone footage, and signed contracts. Facts don't rattle. The breakthrough moment came when the prosecution called one of the fired engineers. He testified that he'd refused to sign off on the slope, that Karen ordered him to modify the report, and that when he refused, his signature mysteriously appeared on the final version anyway. He said it clearly, without anger, without theatrics. My name was forged. A murmur rolled through the courtroom. Even the judge paused. More residents testified. Stories of ignored warnings, threats of HOA fines, concealed soil cracks, and meetings where Karen told them discussing ground movement would harm property values. The final witness, a FEMA official, flatly confirmed that ignoring a freeze order wasn't just reckless. It was criminal. By the end of the day, Karen's defiance cracked. Her confident posture slumped. She whispered angrily to her attorneys. She flinched every time another piece of evidence appeared on the screen. And when the prosecutor delivered a quiet, devastating closing argument, detailing every lie, every shortcut, every dismissed warning, she stared at the floor like she could feel the mountain collapsing under her all over again. The jury didn't deliberate long. They found her guilty on every major count: fraud, negligence, document falsification, and reckless endangerment. Her mouth fell open like she expected someone to object on her behalf, but the courtroom stayed silent except for the judge's voice reading the verdict. For the first time since the collapse, I felt the weight in my chest loosen. Not entirely, but enough. The fight wasn't over yet, but the truth had finally landed harder than the mudslide itself. The sentencing hearing didn't have the drama of the trial, but it had a different kind of tension. Quiet, precise, final. Karen sat rigid in her chair, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were bone white. Her attorneys had abandoned theatrics. Instead, they offered a subdued plea for leniency, citing stress, overwhelming responsibility, and misinterpretation of regulations. The judge looked about as convinced as someone listening to a toddler explain why the cookie jar mysteriously fell off the counter. When the court asked if Karen wanted to speak, she rose slowly. For a moment, I thought she might finally acknowledge what she'd done. Instead, she launched into a rambling statement about how she was misled by professionals, how the collapse was a tragic anomaly, how she never intended harm. Not once did she mention the residents who'd lost their homes. Not once did she acknowledge the falsified documents. She didn't even say the word slope, as if avoiding it would rewrite physics. The judge let her finish, then delivered a sentence that was merciful only in its clarity. 16 years in state custody, no suspended time, mandatory restitution hearings to follow, a prohibition from serving on any board, association, or development project for the rest of her life. Karen froze mid-breath, her mouth slightly open in disbelief, as if she'd expected the universe to reward her boldness instead of punishing her recklessness. Deputies placed handcuffs on her wrists. She tried to protest, weakly at first, then with rising panic, but the sound echoed in a courtroom that had already moved on. Once she was escorted out, the remaining proceedings addressed Summit Crest itself. The HOA was formally dissolved by court order, its funds frozen pending civil claims. The destroyed homes were declared uninhabitable and transferred into FEMA's disaster assistance category. Residents would receive compensation through federal channels, though most would still be filing separate lawsuits against Karen personally. Meanwhile, the land, my old 9 acres, was returned to county jurisdiction. The judge called it environmentally compromised and developmentally unsuitable. In other words, exactly what I'd said from the beginning, just in legal language carved into the public record. A few reporters caught me outside the courthouse. They asked if I felt vindicated. I didn't know how to answer that. Vindication implies victory, but standing in the cold morning air with the memory of those houses sliding into darkness still fresh, it didn't feel like one. What I felt instead was relief, like watching a long, dangerous storm finally break apart. Over the next few weeks, things changed quietly. Investigators asked me to assist with a formal geological review of the area, not as a defendant or accuser, but as someone who still understood this mountain better than anyone else left standing. I agreed without hesitation. If the land had drawn this much trouble, the least I could do was help prevent future disasters. One afternoon, while walking a ridge above what used to be Summit Crest, I stopped at a vantage point where the destroyed homes once stood. In the distance, excavators were removing debris under FEMA supervision, tracing the slide path I'd mapped years ago as a young engineer. The smell of wet clay still lingered in the air, familiar and heavy. Seeing the exposed layers of earth reminded me of something I'd always believed: land doesn't lie. People do. Paperwork does. Ambition definitely does. But soil tells the truth every time, whether we want to hear it or not. I stood there for a while, letting the silence settle. My remaining 8 acres stretched below, quiet, untouched, steadfast. A few local reporters had started calling me the man who warned them, which sounded dramatic and slightly embarrassing, but I understood the sentiment. In a way, they were right. I'd warned them. I just never expected how violently the mountain would deliver the proof. Before heading back down, I made myself a promise. I wasn't going to sell another inch of this land. Not to a developer, not to a visionary, not to anyone who thought nature could be negotiated with. Instead, I started drafting plans for something different. A small educational program focused on slope stability and safe building practices. Nothing grand, nothing commercial. Just a place where people could learn how not to repeat the mistakes that nearly killed a community. The mountain had spoken loudly. The least I could do was help others learn to listen.